In this lesson, you'll learn more about the classes and objects used to implement a content provider. We'll focus on the content interface, data subset, and content provider function blocks shown in our conceptual diagram discussed in the previous lesson. In lessons on user interface and database management, we'll return to this app to further explore those functions in more detail. So let's look at an expanded view of these three blocks. This graphic explores more detail about our three groups: content interface, data subset, and content provider. As we discussed in a previous lesson, the chain of events starts in the user interface, which is displaying information and collecting input from the user. The content interface exchanges data with the user interface. It then uses the 5 key methods: query, update, insert, delete, and getType to interface with the data subset, which in turn feeds the content provider, which in turn invokes database management to update and retrieve data on the database. The content interface also handles return values that flow back through this same chain and are passed back to the user interface. Now notice a small detail in the content interface and content resolver blocks. In the content interface, the terminology labeling the methods is that the main methods used are. In the content resolver, the terminology is main methods are. Now, this is because the content interface is creating an instance of the content resolver object and is using the 5 methods that are actually part of the content resolver class and object. The content interface assembles its data and uses the classes in the data subset block, content resolver, URI, cursor, and content values, to construct methods to query the database, update entries, insert new entries, delete entries, or get the MIME type of a file. Collectively, the URI, cursor, and content values provide information to the content provider about exactly what data should be included in the data subset. The content interface is my label for this group of code. In some apps, it might be located in a single activity. In other apps, it might be spread out among a number of activities. But let's take a look inside our sample app at some content interface code. In our sample Notepad app, there's content interface code in the Notes list, Note Editor, and Title Editor source modules. For example, in the Note Editor file, starting at line 586, we have a statement that uses the update method. A note about showing line numbers in Eclipse. Showing the numbers will help us identify blocks of code. To turn line numbers on and off in Eclipse, click on Window, then Preferences, then General, then Editors, and within Editors, Text Editors. And within Text Editor, toggle this switch here, Show Line Numbers, and click OK. And now back to our code. It's a sequence involving 2 methods. The first is the getContentResolver method that returns a content resolver instance for your application's package. The second is the update method in the content resolver, and it uses 4 parameters. The first is a URI indicating the record to update. The second is a content values variable indicating the column names and values to apply. And the third and fourth that would indicate a selection criteria, but they're left null because the URI specifies a single record in this case. In the content provider lessons on all these methods, we'll go into detail about all the parameters and how they're used. At this point, I just want you to see one of them in our app. And now let's go back to our graphic. Notice how the group of 5 methods, query, update, insert, delete, and getType, are repeated in the content interface, content resolver, and content provider. And notice also that the names content resolver and content provider are single names with no spaces between the words, indicating that they're class names. Content interface is not a class. It uses the 5 methods by getting a content resolver object and using its methods, as we saw in the code sample we just looked at. As I said, we'll go into detail in a coming content provider lesson on the details of the 5 methods, their parameters, and how they're used. For now, we'll focus on how all the pieces fit together. The big picture is important. Because we're dealing with multiple occurrences of the 5 methods, It's very easy to get confused about what's going on, so stick with me. And let's look at a bit more detail about the URI, cursor, and content values. Together, the URI, cursor, and content values provide a data specification that details where the data is located. The URI indicates a data subset to be operated on. The cursor tracks and provides the row number, and content values provide a column number and value. So together they provide a triangulation for the methods to locate and work with data. There are upcoming content provider lessons with more details on these elements. Now back to our main graphic. Now let's move on to the content provider. The content provider does double duty. It manages the interface with the content resolver and also manages the interface with data access to update and retrieve data. On the resolver side, I'm calling this provider access. On the data side, I'm calling it data access. On the resolver side, provider access, when one of the 5 methods is executed by the content interface, the corresponding method in the content provider is invoked. The method in the content provider contains code that overrides the method in the content resolver, which is executing the corresponding method to access data. It's a bit confusing, I know. We'll get into the code to see how all this works in a coming content provider lesson. For now, just absorb the concept that the string of methods with the same name are used to cause action on the data, all the way over here, in the database when the corresponding method is executed all the way over here in the content interface. And once you understand all the details, you'll see it's actually a pretty slick way to create a chain of similar events across multiple activities. Another detail to notice in this graphic is the inclusion of file management along with database management. Content providers can be used to transfer whole files as well as data from a database. But we won't be covering this capability in this course, and you can find out more about it on the developer's website. Notice also that there's one method included in the content provider that you don't see in the content interface or content resolver. It's the onCreate method. And we'll cover this method along with all the others in a coming content provider lesson. So that's our lesson on content provider classes and objects. Before moving on to deeper detail about content providers in coming lessons, please take the time to make sure you've absorbed this overview of classes and objects. You might also want to print out the graphics for this lesson to have them handy during the next content provider lessons.